Hello, everyone. My name is Karen Rego. I am the Manager of Sales Operations and Payer Relations at Immunovia. Today, I'd like to give a brief overview of reimbursement in the U.S. and describe the general process and considerations for seeking reimbursement for a new clinical laboratory test. So to start, let's take a look at the types of healthcare insurance there is in the U.S. There are two major categories. They are the public government health plans and the private commercial plans. The public government plans are Medicare and Medicaid, which are both run by CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Medicare is the program for people 65 and older and for people with certain disabilities. There are three parts to coverage of Medicare. Clinical laboratory tests fall under Medicare Coverage Part B. Medicare is a federally funded plan that is administered regionally by Medicare Administrative Contractors, which are referred to as MACs. Medicaid is the program for low-income individuals and for individuals with disabilities. Medicaid is administered separately by each state, and it is funded jointly by state and federal governments. So switching now to the private commercial plans, these are vast in number, and they range in size from very large national plans to relatively small regional plans. There are more than 900 private health plans in the U.S., and each plan maintains its own separate coverage and reimbursement policies. A report from the U.S. Census Bureau showed how the U.S. population was distributed in healthcare coverage between the public and private health plans in 2018. The data showed that about 67% of Americans were enrolled in private plans. With the 2018 population being about 326 million, the enrollment in private plans equates to about 218 million people. This is also referred to as 218 million covered lives. The public plans had an enrollment of about 34% of the U.S. population, which represents 112 million covered lives, 58 million of which were Medicare enrollees. Now, you may have noticed that these enrollment numbers total more than 100%. This is because the public and private plans are not mutually exclusive, meaning that an individual can't have coverage under both types of plans at the same time, which results in them being counted twice in these numbers. This enrollment data also illustrates that both public and private plans have significant enrollment, and both need to be considered when seeking broad reimbursement for a clinical laboratory test. But regardless of the type of plan, there are three main components to reimbursement for a clinical laboratory test. The three components are coding, coverage, and rate. Coding is a 5-digit identifier with an accurate description that is unique for each test. These codes are issued and maintained by the American Medical Association, or the AMA. Coverage is defined as the explicit policy held by each plan that describes which patients and with what specific conditions are eligible. Rate is the dollar amount that the test will be reimbursed at. For public payers or public plans, the rate for every code is published on a fee schedule and is available to the public. For the private plans or payers, rates are negotiated separately and assigned by contract. However, it should be noted that private payers often look to the public rates as guidance in their coverage determinations. So for a new clinical laboratory test, what is needed to address these components? Let's start by taking a look at coding. You'd first review all existing codes published by the AMA and select the one that most accurately describes the test that you're looking to offer. If there is no code available that describes it, you'd apply for a new code. For coverage, each payer will want to evaluate the test data to determine if and when it's medically necessary. To do this, the test provider prepares and presents a comprehensive dossier that contains data and publications demonstrating the test's analytical and clinical validity and its clinical utility. And I'll talk more about each of these data elements in an upcoming slide. Regarding rate, all existing codes have reimbursement rates assigned by CMS that can be found on the Clinical Lab Fee Schedule, referred to as the CLFS. For a new test code, CMS assigns a test reimbursement rate using either a crosswalk or gap filling method. Public payers will follow the CLFS, but as I previously mentioned, private payers will require negotiations and contracting to establish their own consistent reimbursement rates. Having defined the components of reimbursement, let's now take a closer look at coding. So as I mentioned, it's the AMA who has developed and maintains the uniform code set that's universally used in the US. This code set is used to identify and describe all medical, surgical, and diagnostic services. The code set is based on current procedural technology, also referred to as CPT codes. The code set is structured in three main categories, categories 1 through 3, and a subsection called PLA codes that was added in 2017. Clinical laboratory tests primarily fall under Category 1 CPT codes under the laboratory and pathology section. So that's the category we'll focus on here. Clinical laboratory tests can also be described by PLA codes, which are a means for laboratories and manufacturers to more specifically identify their test. There are general requirements for all new CPT code applications. Some of these requirements include that the test be unique, well-defined, and distinct from all current services, the test is not a fragment of an existing service, and the test then satisfies all category-specific criteria. So if we look now to the Category 1 specific criteria, you can see here that some of the requirements include that the test be FDA approved where applicable, the test is widely performed in the US, and the test is supported in literature. PLA codes, being a subsection of Category 1, are not held to the same criteria as Category 1, and they have their own set of criteria as listed here. PLA codes require that the test be performed by a single laboratory and that the PLA code be requested by that laboratory. The test is available in the US and the test be performed on human specimens. Based on these criteria, then, it's understandable that the process for being granted a Category 1 CPT code is more involved and lengthy than that for a PLA code. So for example, if you look at the Category 1 criteria, you can see that 3 to 5 published peer-reviewed publications are required with the application. The application and review process is lengthy as it requires endorsement and approval by multiple CPT authorized groups. This application process usually takes about 18 to 24 months to complete. And that is in addition to the up to 5 years it can take to get the 3 to 5 peer-reviewed publications. PLA codes, on the other hand, do not have defined publication requirements, and applications are accepted 4 times a year according to a published schedule. New PLA codes are correspondingly issued 4 times a year. This application process can take as little as 6 months to complete. While being granted a CPT or PLA code is an important step in the reimbursement process, it's important to note that obtaining a code does not imply or guarantee coverage. Coverage needs to be addressed separately, so let's take a look at coverage in a little more detail. To get a positive coverage determination, a payer will need evidence that the test is medically necessary and provides an unmet need for their members. There are 4 key considerations that need to be addressed to accomplish this. The first consideration is regarding problem awareness. This refers to the question, what is the clinical problem the product is intended to address? To answer this, it's important to clearly define and describe the current burden of illness, gaps in standard of care, and implications of insufficient care. The next consideration is target population, which is who is the product for and when should it be used? Key points in addressing this should include details about the incidence and prevalence of the condition in the intended population, the size of the intended population, and how they are identified. You'll also want to address where the test is used in the clinical setting. The third consideration is evidence. In other words, what is the proof that the test will work in the intended population? To answer this, it's important to provide substantial published clinical trial evidence, evidence to validate use in the actual setting, and documented physician support. The last consideration is cost. Ideally, providing the payer with an economic assessment showing how the test provides cost avoidance, cost offset, or cost containment is beneficial. Showing cost effectiveness relative to the standard of care is also beneficial. Ultimately, though, the payer will want to know the effect the new test would have on their costs and their overall budget. While all 4 of these key considerations are important and should be adequately addressed when seeking coverage, the most crucial in obtaining a positive coverage determination is evidence. So let's talk about evidence in a bit more detail. Evidentiary data must include studies that demonstrate analytical validity, and clinical utility. The evidentiary elements addressing validity speak to the test performance, both in the laboratory and in the relevant patient population. Specifically, analytical validity describes how accurately and how reliably the test measures the analyte of interest. Clinical validity describes how well the test detects the presence or absence of a condition. Key measurements that you'll often hear in this data element are clinical sensitivity, specificity, PPV, and NPV. The last data element is clinical utility, which is of particular interest to payers in coverage determinations. Clinical utility is defined as the clinical effectiveness or usefulness of the test. Studies demonstrating clinical utility must show that the test result is actionable, meaning that it is used to guide treatment, and the impact of the treatment decisions are of significant magnitude. Test results should correlate with changes in patient management that are likely to result in improved outcomes. In addition to published studies, payers will also look to national guidelines in coverage determinations. Inclusion in guidelines is a strong driver of coverage, but it is not a requirement. Endorsement by key opinion leaders or KOLs and adoption by leading institutions can also be significantly strong drivers of reimbursement. So while on the topic of guidelines, just a few additional comments about guidelines in the US. So guidelines in the US are published by independent specialty medical groups, each of which have their own criteria for adoption. In general, though, all guidelines require a significant number of peer-reviewed publications demonstrating clinical utility. Key opinion leaders and leading institutions' adoption generally drives guideline changes or inclusions, and industry is generally prohibited from participating in guideline development. So with so many payers in the US, it's usually a good strategy to target certain payers first when seeking coverage for a new test. In most cases, it is practical to start with Medicare since it is a national public plan to which commercial payers often look to for guidance on their coverage determinations. Targeting private payers may include select national or regional plans that meet certain desired criteria. For example, perhaps there are plans that have relevant coverage policies already in place, or perhaps they serve a particular patient demographic of interest to your test. Regardless of how the payers are prioritized, it's essential to make the most of all payer interactions by presenting a compelling dossier that conclusively demonstrates the test's value. So this concludes the reimbursement overview I wanted to share with you today. Thank you so much for your attention.